Hello, good afternoon. Welcome back. Okay, so today we're gonna finish this chapter for convolutional neural network. Okay, we will first finish the part for the object detection. Okay, last time we started this section. We introduced the problem, right? And then today we're gonna cover some of the details. Well, I think it's very deep field. I mean, there's new algorithms proposed, but the most classical ones that we're gonna cover a little bit about is the Yolo algorithm. That is has a lot of interesting aspects that are pretty much related to the convolutional neural network knowledge we have introduced in our several lectures for this chapter. Okay, so we will cover the key components for a object detection algorithm, and there's plenty of resource online. Most of those algorithms, they are published as papers that are free, that have freely available online, both mostly in the archive websites, and also in the GitHub websites. There are tons of repos that are implemented created to implement the models. Okay, so what I will cover in the lectures is not about every piece of details, okay, but about the general principle and the general designing idea. Okay, and then after this object detection is done, what we're gonna do is to go through the a Jupyter notebook for convolutional neural network, which covers the basic convolutional operations in PyTorch, so that you can have a sense of what kind of these operations, what kind of input it takes, what kind of output it generates, and how in general you can use these building blocks to build complex models of your own interest. Okay, yeah, so let's get started. So we have covered this slide last time, right? So because the problem of detecting object in an image is a different than the pure image classification. It requires more outputs other than the probabilities, right? If it's just a pure classification, then we can simply output the probabilities for all the categories, for all the classes, whether this is a car, a pedestrian, or a motorcycle, or just a background. We can use this output from a softmax layer, and that'll be sufficient, right? But if it's the problem of localization, then apparently we need more than that. We need the location information also output within the output, right? So we want the prediction, the output to contain the class information and the coordinates information that describes the location of the objects, okay, within the image. Okay, so we call these red boxes around the object being recognized as the bounding box, as it's a bound along outside of the objects, right? So there are 4 quantities within that defines this bounding box. So on the next slide, we will have the definitions for these 4 quantities. So usually a bounding box, so it's a rectangle, okay? That's the most common case. So we should define this bounding box using the relative coordinates. Okay, because the images, the input images can be of variance sizes. Like it can be like smaller ones, like 50 by 50 pixels. That is a tiny image, right? But if like we have 1,000 by 1,000 images, and those lengths can be at different scales, right? So what we can do is to use the relative coordinates. A typical practice is that, okay, we let the upper left corner to be the 0 points, okay, and the bottom left, the bottom right to be 1 and 1. So the 1 is for x, and the second one is for the y-axis. Okay, so given these two coordinates defined, then each point within the region of the image can be defined with a quantity that's between 0 and 1, right? So for example, what's shown here is a box with a central point, and these central points indicated by this red dot in the middle, it's the center position of the object, or we can say it's a midpoint of the object. Okay, it's a point that we use to indicate the position, right, of the objects being recognized. If we just use one pair of coordinates to describe it, then we use the midpoint. Okay, so these bx and by, these are numbers, relative number. These are numbers between 0 and 1. Okay, they are within the range, within the region of this image. Okay, so that is the bx and by, and other than the midpoint, other than the central position, we need to describe the relative height of it, right? Which is bh, the relative height, and the relative width, which is the bw. Okay, so in this example, because the image contains a complete car, right? So the bh and bw, they are also within the range of 0 and 1, right? But in practices, it's not unusual that the bh and bw can be larger numbers. They can be even larger than 1, right? Because sometimes you have a very big car, very long car, right? That's go beyond the range of the input image. That is totally possible. Okay, so anyway, those bh and bw, they are also, in this case, they are also the relative quantities that are proportionate to the original length, original height and width of the input image, right? So that is how the bounding box are defined. We basically use these four quantities. All right, and then because it's a supervised learning task, we need to define the target label. Okay, now considering it is a hybrid task that's in which we want to do both the prediction and the localization at the same time. So we need to construct the target label by including the class information and the bounding box. Okay, so now the ground truth would be like this. It is no longer a single number, a single quantity, but it is a vector that have 8 elements in it. Okay, in this case, it is 8 elements. Okay, so let's look at the meanings of these 8 elements. So assume that we have 3 classes to predict. So the three target classes are car, pedestrian, and a motorcycle. And the special class is the background. So I think in most object detection tasks, there will always a background label included. So it's basically for irrelevant information, for background information, which means the model doesn't recognize anything significant. So in that case, it will output a label to indicate this is a background. Okay. So with this setup, let's look at the first components, the first elements in the label vector. It's called PC. Okay. So the P is for probability, I think, and the C is for classes. So the PC is a binary, 0 or 1. So if this PC is for zero, then it tells that there's no object, okay, in the image. Or 1, when it's 1, then it means that there's indeed an object in the image. Okay, so PC is either 0 or 1, as for ground truth. Okay, so the next 4 quantities are the bounding boxes introduced, the bounding box coordinates introduced in the previous slide. Okay, it describes the midpoints and the relative height and width of the box. Okay, and the last 3 positions, they describe the class probabilities. So in this case, if it's ground truth, then these C1, C2, and C3, they should be either 0 or 1. It's a one hot encoding schema. Like if it's car, then it should be C1 should equal 1 and C2 equals 0 and C3 equals 0. That is for car, right? Then if it's a pedestrian, right? If it's a pedestrian, then it should be 0, 1, 0. And if it's motorcycle, it should be 0, 0, 1. So it's a typical one hot encoding label. All right, that is for the ground truths. And so having these ground truths defined, let's see what the prediction could be. Okay, all right. So on the right, we're not yet about the predictions yet. So it's still ground truth. So if the PC is 1, then the ground truth looks like this, right? If PC is 1, then the ground truth will have meaningful locations for the bounding box and a meaningful class probabilities. But on the other in the other side, if we have 0 for PC, which means there's no object in that image, in that training example, then we will have like those question marks indicates these values are irrelevant. It can be any values, okay? Which means we don't care about what these values are because it is a non-objective. It is a no object case, okay? So that's basically how we define the target labels. How do we prepare the target labels in the training sets? Okay, so that's how we prepare the data so that the models can work on this, can be trained on this training data. Okay, so let's look at the next. The next key step in a typical supervised learning task is to define the loss or cost function, right? Another way to say it is cost function. Okay, so the loss is basically how the difference between the prediction and the ground truth. So now we know the ground truth is a vector with 8 elements, and it looks like this. If this ground truth, if this image contains a car, right, it should be start with a 1 because the PC should be 1, indicates it's there is indeed an object in it, right? So for example, if our model make a prediction as y hat 1, and the prediction starts with a 0.9, right, which is pretty accurate, right? Because the ground truth is 1, right? And it predicts a 0.9, okay? So which basically tells that the model believes 90% there's an object in it, okay? And it also computes the, outputs a 4 numbers for the bounding box and also the class probabilities, right? The class probability says that there's 0.85% probability as a car, 0.1 as a pedestrian, 0.05 as a motorcycle, etc. Okay, so it's like this. So this is a prediction and the ground truth. Let's see how we can construct a loss function for it. Okay, so it's basically we want to distinguish between like two cases depending on the ground truth is. Okay, so in this case, of course, the ground truth is 1. Okay, so the loss between the prediction and the ground truth is actually has 3 components. Okay, corresponding to the 3 parts of the target label. So the first loss component, it should measure whether the prediction PC is accurate, right? So the first loss should measure the difference between this one and the ground truth 1 here. Okay, so since the label PC is a binary, it's either 0 or 1. So does it remind you of something that we are familiar with? So it's a very typical logistic regression problem, right? So the outputs here should considered as a prediction of some logistic regression model, right? So in logistic regression, the loss function is like this. It's like the negative of the ground truth times the logarithm of the prediction plus the 1 minus the ground truth times the logarithm of 1 minus the prediction, right? So I put a superscript, a subscript 1 here to indicate that this y1 is actually the first component of the y, right? So it's actually the y1 here. So another way of it saying it is this is the PC, right? And this is the PC being predicted. Let's call it PC hats. Okay, that's also okay if you want to write it in this way. So that is the first loss components. Okay, and that makes sense because this is a binary prediction task. Okay, so the next loss should describe how accurate the prediction of the bounding box is, right? We want a very accurate bounding box being predicted. So the difference between these predicted value and the ground truth should also be minimized. All right. So I think I didn't type in the right formula here. So I'm gonna fix it. Okay, I think I copied the formula from the logistic regression, but really it should be a summation of square errors. Okay, so this is not correct. I'm gonna fix it later. So it should be basically the summation of, let's put it that way. It should be like bx minus bx prime square plus by minus by prime square and bh and bw. These 4 square errors adding up together as a total square error. Okay, because we want the distance between the b's and the b primes as small as possible. So this square error loss should be used. Okay, so that's the second part, and the last part is something we are familiar with. It is the class label prediction, like how accurate this probability distribution is close to this ground truth. Okay, so this loss L3 is in the form of softmax loss or cross entropy loss. Okay, so we have a slide in the same in this slide, I guess. Yeah, so describing the softmax regression and the cross entropy loss. Okay, so which is a more general case for our logistic regression loss. Okay, so with L1, L2, and L3 defined, we're able to train a model. Okay, right? If we take that L as the loss, and then we can use the derivatives of the loss with respect to all the parameters in our model to update the parameters, and then we are able to have the model trained against the data. Okay, and that is for case 1. And for the case 2, where the PC is 0, then which means we will have a bunch of question marks. We'll have a bunch of question marks here, so which means they don't really matter. So we only need to consider the first loss, which is about whether PC is accurately predicted or not. Okay, so that's typically how the loss is constructed in the object's localization task. Okay, so if there's no questions, I'm gonna proceed on to the next slide. Okay. All right, so the localization task for a simple object like a car, right, in the traffic image, or animal image like detecting a dog in a grassland, right? So these can be extended to more sophisticated situations where there are more than just 4. There are more than simple rectangle boxes to be predicted. Okay, so actually we can use a similar setting to localize the key points that are in the more complex landmarks, like the key points on your face, key points in your body joints. So all these key points, local coordinates, they are also in the relative coordinates within the image of a face or image of a body. Okay, so these can be learned in a similar style. Okay, so for example, if we use the face as the inputs, okay, we basically can use a similar method, like first convert the image, feed the image into a convolutional network, and then the final outputs should also contain whether there's a face in it. So this PC is similar to this P of face is similar to the PC in it, right? So if this one is a for ground truth, there's a face in it. So then these L's should be the first landmark and the second landmark until all the faces we have, all the landmark points we have, right? So the example is from the PyTorch websites, and these first pair L1X and L1Y indicates the first points in the landmark, for example here. Okay, so the square errors between the predicted values and the ground truth will be used to train the model. Okay, just like the bounding box case. And to the body case, it's also the similar method. Okay, for example, this is the animation I found, the data, the example I found from MediaPipe's website, and actually it's a really I think it's a state-of-art technique for body pose track. Okay, so actually on their website there's something really cool you can try even on your laptop, as long as you have a webcam, and then you can detect not just the body but also the face mesh, like the key points on your face, like the hand gestures, like the key points, each joint of your fingers. Okay, the whole hands can be tracked. So with these points tracked, there's actually a lot of interesting AR techniques like can be implemented. So it's like, how do you want to so for example, in the Zoom application, we can actually put on a virtual sunglasses, put on a virtual crown, right? Put on some virtual makeups. Those are all based on the key points detected on your face, the key point detected on your hands, for example. So we can design an app that's put on the gloves on the two hands based on the hands detected. Okay. So yeah, that is the landmarks as an extension to the bounding box detection task.
Professor, can you repeat the link of that?
You mean the media pipe?
Yeah, media pipe. Okay.
Yeah, it's media pipe. Okay. All right. So, yeah. So we are done with the first step, which is to design a pipeline for object classification with localization. Right. We take an input with one image, and then the output is the output contains the class probabilities and the bounding boxes. Okay, so a complete object detection frameworks pipeline should do more than that. Okay, so well, the first step we'll use a car detection as an example here. Is that we need to prepare some closely cropped car images. It's like the image, the training data that we need to prepare at this step is that the images should not be like a big image that have a tiny car in those images. Okay, so these are not perfect examples for the training a detection model. Okay, so for the training, we need to zoom in to these smaller areas. Okay, and we want to focus on these smaller areas that a car, it could be the majority, occupies the majority space in that input image. Okay, so these are more better training examples in training such a car detection model. Okay, so we can prepare such training labels, training data and training labels, and then we basically train a ConvNet classification model. Okay, that not just outputs the X and Y's. So here X and Y's are just I simplified X and Y's, but we also need to have the ground truth about those bounding boxes. Okay, so this step is the step that requires manual data labeling. Okay, so like we have outsourced factories that hire workers to like manually label, like drag a box, like find a box for all the cars in an image, like and these ground truths generated by the workers will be used by the machine learning model to train on. Okay. All right, so that is the first step. Okay, so the next step is actually an important key step, which is to apply the sliding windows detection. Okay, on an actual data set, on an actual input image. Okay, so the sliding windows detection is like, given an actual image, right? If we want to detect how many cars are there in this image, or we want to track each car in this image, then we need to work on different regions in the image because it's so different. It's very different from the training data we used to train the car detection model, right? The car detection, on the previous slide, all the images are closely cropped, okay? But this one is not. So what we're gonna do is to use some sliding window, okay? So to scan through this test image, right? Will this sliding window, for example, we will place the sliding window onto the left corner. That is our first region, okay? All right, so one thing about this sliding window, the size of it can be an arbitrary value, okay? But it is not, this is not a convolutional filter, okay? So this red box is not a filter, okay? A filter is really small, right? Like a 3x3 filter, but this is not. This is a sliding window. It is a very large, relatively speaking, it is a pretty large region, okay? And we're gonna like use this region to slide over this test image, and in that image, we will, within that region, we'll apply the model that we trained from the previous step, okay? So this input image, the size of this input image should basically be close to the training data image, to the training data that this model has been trained on, right? So in the previous slide, we said this model M should be trained on a bunch of closely cropped car images. So if we have a sense of how big those training data are, right, we should decide how large a slide window we should use in this step, okay? So we use this red box as a window. That is the first window that we use. And because there's no car in it, then the model should give output a prediction of 0, right? Okay, and then we will slide the window towards right for some distance, and this distance is also up to the user, okay? Like we can decide how much step we go, right? If we want the prediction to be accurate, then we want to be conservative in moving the sliding window by a small step, right? But that's up to us to decide, okay? For example, in the second region, third region, right? Fourth region, for example, we move to this region, okay, it looks like there's a car in it. Then a good model, if it's trained well, then it should be able to output a y hat equals 1, okay? So I see Matthew has a question.
Yeah, so if your window moves too small a distance, will it double count the cars? Like if there's
Yes.
a lot of overlap? Okay.
Yes, yes. So that is a potential problem. So double prediction is a problem, and more importantly, if we slide the window too slow, then there's gonna be way more computation needed, right? Because in each slide, in each step, we will apply the model, which means we want to apply all the convolutional computation. Okay, so the problem of this sliding window detection is that we will need to there will be too much computation. Okay, so the window can be bigger size. For example, like we can pass a little bit smaller, a little bit larger window, okay, or it could be a even larger window. So we can combine the results of these different passes, right? So I don't have those details for how to overcome the overlap predicting, like the duplicate predicting. But these technically we can solve those problems by basically averaging, use the average prediction from multiple passes. Okay, but the thing with this method is that if we're gonna do this for each position under the sliding window, then it's gonna cost us too much computation. Okay, so a general method is proposed to solve this computation, the problem with the computation cost is called this implementing the sliding window with convolution. Okay, so the paper that first introduced this method is called the overfeeds. Okay, so generally speaking, this paper is to apply the convolutional filter on the test image for just once without using the sliding window. Okay, so if you look at let's first look at the upper parts. Okay, let's first look at this part. So this is the training stage, and the training image, you can imagine it as a 14 by 14 input image, and say the model will first apply a 5 by 5 convolutional filter on this training image, right? So this 5 by 5 filter will be first applied to this upper left corner, 5 by 5 corner, and the output will be a basically a 1 pixel in the output volume, right? So, and next, for the next step, we will apply a 2 by 2 filter, a 2 by 2 pooling layer onto this 10 by 10 inputs, which will result in a 5 by 5 outputs. And then again, a 5 by 5 filter will be applied to this 5 by 5, which will result in a 1 by 1 outputs. Okay, and then another 1 by 1 convolutional, which will result in a 1 by 1 output layer. Okay, so this is a pipeline for this a complete run on this training image. Okay, so the thing with the testing image. So if we now look at the second half, the lower half, the testing image is usually of different size as the input image. So if we have this 16 by 16 test image, so the additional parts, the additional pixels that need to be covered by the model is marked as this yellow, is highlighted as these yellow cells, right? So if we are using the sliding window technique, what we're gonna do is that we should use first crop this 14 by 14 region and apply the model to this region. Then it will generate some 1 by 1 results, right? So if we are going to use a sliding window, so then the next step of the sliding window, let me use a different color, for example, is to move the sliding window towards right by 2 pixels. And we have the second 14 by 14, right? Which will also generate a 1 by 1 output, okay? And then the third sliding window would cover this lower left region. Oops. Right, the third 14 by 14 sliding window will cover this lower left region, right? That will generate again a 1 by 1. The last region will also again generate a 1 by 1 region. Okay, so what you can find is that actually, if we look at how much overlap we have with these 4 sliding regions, sliding windows, right? We have different colors. Let me use the. Oops. Right, the first is blue, second is orange, the last is pink, and then we have let's use a green one. Okay. So these 4 sliding windows, they actually have a lot of overlap, which is in the middle, right? Which is marked by this yellow color. Okay. So these overlap region has been covered for multiple times. It has been computed in the first slide window and second slide window and the third and fourth, okay? Which means this is unnecessary, okay? So what's proposed in this paper is that actually we don't need to use the slide window. Actually, we can just directly apply the same filter, the convolutional model filter, to the test image for once. Okay, we can directly apply the model and compute all the convolutional operations to all the pixels in the test image for once, and that will give us a 2x2 region, which is in the desired size. Okay, because the blue parts, let me use the blue cell here, the lower left, the upper left cell, the blue cell here corresponds to the results of applying the model to this region as inputs. Okay, and this yellow, upper right yellow, corresponds to this second sliding window. Okay, so it has such a corresponding relationship, but in practice we don't need to really apply a sliding window. We just apply the model, we just apply the convolutional model once for all the pixels. Okay, so this is the so-called improving sliding window, implementing sliding window with convolution, which means we don't actually use a window to slice, but we just applied all the convolutional filters once. So that's, of course, significantly saves amount of computation resources, right? So this is something what we will use in the Yolo algorithm. Okay, so this Yolo algorithm is for you only look once, which is another word of saying that we don't slide over all the we don't use a sliding window to go through all the pixels for multiple times. But what we're gonna do is that given a picture like this, we will create some grids. Okay, because the test input is usually larger than the training examples. Okay, and for each grid we will make a prediction. Okay, we will directly use that grid as input to make a prediction, and the prediction should look like this, right? As indicated by the the target label in the training stage. Okay, it should predict, for example, in this blue region, it should predict that, okay, there's a car detected. Okay, and there's a, so the PC should be 1 here, and there's a bounding box should be predicted as well. Okay, so the tricky part is that not the whole body of the car is within this region. Okay, but let's assume that, okay, let's assume that the bounding box is like this. Okay, and then let's assume that the midpoint is still within the region. Okay, so if the central is not within this blue grid, then this output should be not 1, but should be 0, right? Ideally. Okay, so having this predicted, the coordinates, the bx by should be included, right? And the relative width and the relative height should also be included in the outputs. Okay, and then the second example, the orange region, right? Then it should predict 0. It should output 0 as the PC, because there's no complete car detected in this region. Okay, and in the third region there is a car, another car, so it should be 1 PC and 1. Okay, so that is basically what the predictions from the Yolo algorithm should look like. Okay, and what I've shown here in this slide is just the very simple introduction to the algorithm, and in the underlying details, the model should actually be include other techniques like the anchor boxes. We should use anchor boxes of different shapes to detect different objects. Like for pedestrians, we use these anchor box that are in a taller, thinner rectangles. Maybe for cars, we should use like flat rectangles. Okay, so these are the details of the technique which you can find in the paper, and this is really a paper that's worth reading about. Okay, so that's pretty much for the convolutional neural network chapter, and we end with this with the object detection algorithm. So if you have any questions, you can let me know by now. And if not, we are going to go through the Jupyter lab book, Jupyter notebook about the convnets operations. Okay, let me pause the recording. Yeah, okay. So this is a complete showcase example of how you can use convolutional neural network in PyTorch. Okay, so it's I covered some basic operations like convnets, like convolutional layer and the polling layers. Okay, and because in the first lecture, I think some students are curious about the outputs, what the intermediates output could be. Okay, so I will showcase some examples here. It's like you should import the NN model. Okay, so it is the most commonly used module in PyTorch. And again, this time we will use the Torch Vision. The Torch Vision is a standalone module developed by the same company, and it is specifically for the computer vision tasks. Okay, so we will use that, and it provides a transforms function that a transforms component that can allow you to transpose the input image to PyTorch tensors and to normalize those inputs to the regions you want to be. Okay, so these are like a convenient way to pre-process the image so that you don't need to write any manual code anymore. Okay, so the training data sets we're going to use is the one provided by Torch Vision, and it's called, oops, let me zoom in a little bit more. Okay, so it's called the Cypher 10. Okay, it's a famous benchmark data sets that has basically 10 output labels. Okay, 10 kinds of objects to be predicted. Okay, and the data set is loaded, and we will define some data loader. Okay, that is basically provides some iterator to go through the data really conveniently. And the classes, as you can see here, are basically ranges from plane, car, birds, cats, animals, right, and some artifacts. Okay. All right. So if we look at the data, right, looks like this. So the data iterator is something we define on top of data loader, and so within this data iterator, we will have a batch. Okay, so that is a typical operation you need to be familiar with when you are dealing with image data. And basically, all kinds of machine learning work nowadays are organized in the mini batch style. Okay, so this batch is basically a list here, right? If I print the type of the batch here, it shows the list, right? And it's actually two components. The first one is the X. So these images is the X, is the data, right? And the data is in such a shape, right? It's in it's a tensor in 5 by 3 by 32 by 32 tensor. It's a high dimensional tensor. Okay, so where the 5 is from, it means I have 5 images in this mini batch, and the 5 is set here. Okay, when I define the data loader, I define the batch size to be 5. Okay, so this is a very small mini batch size. Usually we will not use this 5, but in order to show the process, I use 5 here. Usually we should use 100 or so, right? Okay, so that's the images. It looks like 5 by 3 by 32 by 32. So that means there are 5 images, and each image is in the shape of 3 by 32 by 32 images, colored image. So it's a bit different from our convention, right? Our convention in the slides is that it should be 32 by 32 by 3, but it's okay. Those dimensions can be moved around basically freely in PyTorch. Okay, so the 3 here, the dimension means this is a channel. This is a dimension for the channels, for the RGB channels. And the 32 is width and height. Okay, and if you look at the labels, it's basically a long tensor, right? It has 5 elements in it, and the labels, if you print it, it'll be 50023, which means this is a dog, plane, bird, and cats. Okay. All right. So next, we will define some convolutional filters, convolutional layers. Okay. The most commonly used module is this one. It's called nn.conv2d. Okay. So this is a very commonly used function that we use to define a convolutional filter. Okay, so these first 3 means that we're defining a filter. No, so the first 3 is for the input channel. Okay, the input channel is 3 here, and the second 6 is the output channel 6. So which means the output will have channels increased to 6. Okay, and these 3, the last 3 is for the filter size, and the default paddings will be 0 and default stride would be 1. Okay, so we basically we can use the formula ourselves to check whether the compute is correct, right? Because right now our input is 32 by 32. So if we use a filter size of 3, then it should be, so the output should be 30 by 30, right? So what we're going to do is to define this conv1 and then call this conv1 on the images. And then we're going to print the shape of out1, right? And then we're going to print the torch vision. We're going to show the images, okay? So let's see what the output could be. Right, pretty interesting, right? We can see that the shape of the out1 is like 5 by 6 by 30 by 30. Okay, so this 5 is the same as this 5, corresponding to 5 images, and the output channels becomes from 3 to 6, right? After we have outputs after we have applied the convolutional filter to it, and width and height is 30 by 30, which is correct, okay? By following this formula, right? So you may be wondering, like, how we can print the images that has 6 channels. So what I did here is a trick that I only take the first 3 channels as if they are the RGB images, but this is not a common practice, which I just put it here just for the curiosity to see how the images look like. Okay, so you can see that the first 3 channels still contain some information about the image, right? We basically define the define this convolutional layer, and it will like randomly initialize all the parameters in the filter. So you see this images becomes blurred, right? But some of the major features are kept in the first 3 channels of the output channel, right? So next step, we actually doing something more interesting. So it's like we define another conv layer, right? This time we set the padding to be 1, right? The other thing is the same. And let's see what the output would be. And additionally, here we did something interesting. We access the weights and the bias of the conv2, okay? So the weight is within that filter. And we use these statements to make the weights be all 0.005. So these are initialized to really small values, okay? And the bias is something we put to 0, okay? So this time, let's see what the outputs would be, okay? Okay, so it gives a warning saying that the inputs, clipping the input data to the valid range, okay? That's okay, we don't need to take care of it right now. But if you look at the output now, it looks like the output is in the same, is in the desired size, right? Because we use paddings, right? We use paddings, which means we should use 32 plus 2 minus 2 as a size, which is 32, right? So it's the same padding. The output has the same size as the input. And the more interestingly, if you look at the range, as the values of it, so this time we basically can observe that the image become this like blurred black and white, right? So it's like we are averaging, we're taking all the pixels in that filtered region and compute it with the dot products with these small values. Okay, so we basically canceled out all the RGB information, right? Since all this smaller value, it's very close to 0, right? So this is something you can try at home if you want to work on if you want to explore how the filters will affect the inputs. Yeah, but this is not our key point here. So it's just for exploration and for some fun experiments. Okay. So the next step is to call with the larger stride. Okay, so if you say we use a larger stride equals 2, then according to the formula, right, we should have a 15 by 15, which is a much smaller image, right, which almost cut into half for the height and the width. So let's just look at the outputs. All right, so you can see that it's cropped into a much smaller region. Okay, and we can barely see the information, like whether we can barely see this is a dog's head, right? Because it is passed through a layer with larger stride. Okay. All right. The next example is the pooling layer. So actually, pooling can be defined in a similar style as the conv layer. Like we can use 2 as the pooling filter size, and with the stride 2, which means this also will cause the image to shrink in its size. Okay, but the pooling layer doesn't change the channels, so it applies to each channel individually. So the results out 4, we can observe the size of it. It's 3 by 16 by 16. So it's like the images becomes blurred, but they don't lose a lot of the color information, right? It's basically the same image, but we pulled out the most significant values. So yeah, you can see that this is like downsampled images that becomes really in the size of 16 by 16, half of the original size. So I think there's 1 more or 2 more examples here. Okay, the last example is the average pooling layer. So like you can use average pool that's with filter size 3. And did we run it? Yeah, we run it. So we should use the stride 1, for example, here, and let's make a comparison with the original image and see what would it be, right? So the average pooling also has a significant effect on the outputs. It's like, because we use the average values of the neighboring region, so the images becomes blurred, like it becomes all the sharp changes are gone. Okay, so that's what I have for this basic convolutional operations. So you can try this on the different data sets. So the flexibility of PyTorch and the Torch Vision is that you can actually download a lot of different types of data sets your own, and then you can work on it. And they also have, PyTorch also provides different types of models. But if you want to know about the more basics, so these type of experiments are something that you would like to try it yourself. And at the beginning, there's a lot of details that you need to be familiar with, because some of those parameters, the positions of those parameters are predefined. So you need to read the APIs of PyTorch yourself quite often at the beginning. But later on, as you get getting more familiar with it, getting more comfortable with it, then everything will be much more smoother. All right, so that's for the so much what we have for today. And congratulations, we are done with the convolutional neural network chapter. And it's breakthrough, technical breakthrough of our age, basically facilitated by the hardwares like GPUs, high performance computing, right? So it's bringing significant changes to our daily lives, but also it brings moral issues. Like we have so powerful models that can not just classify images, but also generates realistic human face images, realistic human-like fake images. So this is really a different type of issue that goes beyond the technical realm. Yeah, so we will know about that generative models in the future lectures as well. So yeah, if you have any questions, you can let me know here, or you can let me know offline by sending me emails.